The church bells of Grace Baptist rang 3 times that morning in May of 1889, and Clara Ellsworth would remember the sound of them for the rest of her life. Not as music, not as celebration, but as a warning she had been too young and too faithful to hear. She stood in the small dressing room behind the sanctuary, smoothing the front of her mother's wedding dress with hands that trembled slightly. The dress had been stored in cedar for 12 years, waiting for this day. Her mother Martha had sewn it herself during a long illness, stitching each seam with the careful precision of a woman who knew she might not live to see her daughter wear it. The fabric was ivory silk, yellowed just slightly at the hem, and the lace at the collar had been cut from Martha's own christening gown. Clara had not wanted to wear anything else. Through the thin walls, she could hear the congregation settling into the pews, Charleston society in their Sunday best. Her Uncle Horace Ellsworth at the front, his waistcoat straining across his belly, already counting in his head how much this marriage would save him. She was 22 years old, an orphan for 3 years now, and today she was supposed to stop being a burden on the only family she had left. She pressed her palm flat against the silver cross that hung at her throat. Her father's cross. Thomas Ellsworth had worn it every Sunday as he preached from the pulpit of this very church, his voice steady and warm, his faith as solid as the pine boards beneath his feet. He had given her the cross the week before. Yellow fever took both him and her mother in the terrible summer of 1886. Wear it, daughter. When you are afraid, when you are alone, when you cannot hear the Lord speaking, this will remind you He is still there. Clara bowed her head and whispered the words she had whispered every night for 2 years. Lord, let me be a good wife. Let me bring honor to my mother's name. Let me serve this man Wendell with patience and grace, and let love grow between us in time the way the old vines grow into the oak. She did not love Wendell Shaw. She had never loved him. But Uncle Horace had made the arrangement 3 summers ago when she was 19 and too grief-stricken to argue, and the Shaw family owned tobacco acres that ran all the way down to the Ashley River. Wendell was 26, handsome, in a thin, sharp way, with pale blue eyes that never quite settled on her face when he spoke. He had called on her every Sunday for 3 years. He had brought her small gifts, ribbons, a volume of Longfellow, once a tin of English tea. He had never once tried to kiss her, which she had taken for respect, and which she understood now, standing in that dressing room with the bells ringing overhead, had been something else entirely. The door opened. Her cousin, Prudence, 16 and already bored with being a bridesmaid, stuck her head in. "They're ready, Clara. Uncle Horace says come now." Clara lifted her bouquet, white carnations, the cheapest flowers the florist sold because Uncle Horace had not wanted to spend more than necessary on a girl who was finally about to stop costing him money. She walked out into the vestibule. The organ began the wedding march. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary swung open, and Clara Ellsworth stepped forward into the worst morning of her life. She saw him at the altar. Wendell in his gray morning coat, his hair pomaded flat against his skull. Beside him stood his father, Colonel Bartholomew Shaw, a tall rail of a man with a white mustache and the cold gaze of a judge pronouncing sentence. As Clara walked down the aisle, she watched Wendell's face. He was not looking at her. He was looking past her. His jaw was tight. His hands kept clenching and unclenching at his sides. When she reached the altar and took her place beside him, she could smell whiskey on his breath. Reverend Caldwell opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and before this company. Wendell turned his head. He leaned close to her ear, close enough that the guests in the first pews thought he might be whispering some tender word. His breath was sour. My father just found out you have nothing, Clara. Not a single dollar. I can't do this. He said it so softly she almost missed it. Then he stepped back. He turned, and in front of 340 people in front of the congregation her father had pastored for 17 years in front of her mother's memory, Wendell Shaw walked away from her. His polished leather boots struck the marble floor in sharp, measured beats. The sound traveled down the long aisle like nails being driven into wood. He did not look back. Colonel Shaw followed him. The two of them passed through the doors and out into the Carolina morning, and the doors fell shut behind them with a soft, final thud. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. Somewhere in the back of the church, a woman gasped. A man coughed. Then came the whispers rising like a tide, the soft, cruel hiss of 300 voices turning to one another and asking the same question. What just happened? Did you see? Did you hear, poor girl? Oh, that poor girl. Clara did not move. She stood at the altar in her mother's dress holding her white carnations, and she watched the doors where Wendell had disappeared. Her eyes were dry. Her breathing was even. Something inside her chest had gone very quiet, as if a candle had been blown out, as if some small, bright thing she had carried there for years had simply ceased to exist. Reverend Caldwell reached for her elbow. She shook her head once gently so he would know she did not want to be touched. She walked to the altar rail. She laid the bouquet down upon it, white carnations against the polished brass. She bowed her head. Her lips moved, and the people who were close enough to see said afterward that she prayed for a full minute, perhaps longer, while the whispers rose around her like a rising river. Then she straightened. She smoothed the front of her dress. She walked back down the aisle with her chin high and her shoulders square, and she did not look at a single face as she passed. Her Uncle Horace reached for her arm. She walked past him. Her cousin Prudence tried to hand her a handkerchief. She walked past her. She walked out of Grace Baptist Church on her own 2 feet alone, and the doors swung shut behind her, exactly the way they had swung shut behind Wendell Shaw. She did not cry until she reached her bedroom that evening, and when she cried for her mother. 3 days later, Uncle Horace came to her door. He did not sit down. He stood in the doorway with his thumbs hooked in his waistcoat, and he told her that she had 2 weeks to leave his house. I cannot keep a girl under my roof who has made a public shame of this family, he said. You will find employment, or you will find another relative, but you will not remain here. Do I make myself understood? Yes, Uncle. She had $9 saved. She had her mother's dress, her father's cross, her Bible, and a small rosewood box her mother had given her on her deathbed with the words, "Open this only when thou art in true need." The box was sealed with red wax. Clara had never broken the seal. She had never felt in any of the sorrows of those 3 years that she was in true need. Not yet. She tried to find work. She walked to every household in Charleston where she had once been welcome. The Pemberton house where she had taken tea a dozen times as a child. The Fairchild estate whose daughter had been her closest friend in finishing school. The Montgomery family whose sons had courted her before Wendell's engagement had put an end to all other prospects. Each door opened. Each door closed. No one would hire the preacher's daughter who had been left at the altar. In Charleston society, shame was contagious, and respectable families did not bring sickness into their homes. On the 8th day, exhausted and frightened, Clara walked to the public library on Meeting Street. She had gone there often as a girl to read. The librarian, old Miss Pennyworth, had always been kind to her, and Clara thought perhaps there might be work there. Dusting, shelving, anything. Miss Pennyworth met her at the door with wet eyes and would not let her inside. "My dear," she whispered, "I cannot. The trustees have spoken. I am so sorry." Clara sat down on a bench outside the library. The sun was hot. A mockingbird was singing in the magnolia tree. A copy of the Matrimonial Times lay abandoned on the bench beside her, left by some reader who had finished with it. She picked it up for no reason she could have named. She opened it for no reason she could have named, and her eye fell upon a small advertisement in the middle of the 3rd page. 4 brothers in Montana Territory seek respectable Christian woman of marriageable age for lawful matrimony with eldest brother. Must be of sound character, able to keep house, and unafraid of honest labor. No widows. Passage paid. Reply to Seahawk Hawks, Ridge, Missoula, Montana. She read the advertisement 3 times. She looked at the mockingbird in the magnolia. She looked at the library door that had been closed against her. She looked down at her hands, which had held her father's cross that morning and had found no comfort in it. Then she folded the newspaper carefully and carried it home. That night, she knelt beside her bed for 2 hours. She prayed the way her father had taught her to pray, not asking for what she wanted, but asking for clarity. "Lord, if this is madness, close this door. If this is thy hand, make me brave. Give me a sign, Father, even the smallest one." She rose from her knees. She went to her writing desk. She took out a sheet of her mother's cream-colored stationery, the last of it, and she dipped her pen and began to write. "Mr. Hawk, my name is Clara Abigail Ellsworth. I am 22 years old, never married, the orphaned daughter of a Baptist minister. My parents are both deceased. I have no dowry and no prospects in my city. I can read and write, cook simple meals, sew and mend, keep a household in order, and sing the hymns. I have no experience of hard country, but I am not afraid of work. My health is good. My faith is sound. If your brothers and yourself find these meager offerings sufficient, I will come. If not, I thank you for your consideration and wish you well. Whither thou goest, I will go." Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16. Respectfully, Clara Ellsworth. She sealed the letter. She walked it to the post office the next morning. She paid the postage with 3 of her $9. Then she went home and waited, and she told no one what she had done. 4 weeks later, the answer came. The envelope was thick. The paper inside was rough, the kind of paper a man might buy at a general store in a frontier town. The handwriting was hard and square, pressed deep into the page, as if the writer had been afraid the words might escape. There was a railway ticket inside, 3 $10 bills, and a single sheet of paper with 6 lines written upon it. "Miss Ellsworth, we received your letter. My brothers and I agreed you sound like an honest woman. The West is not Charleston. Come if your faith is strong. Turn back if it is not. Caleb Hawk." Clara read those 6 lines under her bedroom lamp until the oil burned low. Then she folded the letter, placed it inside her Bible at the Book of Ruth, and began to pack. She did not tell her uncle until the morning she left. She stood in the front hall with her trunk beside her, dressed in her traveling coat, and she informed him that she was going to Montana. He laughed. He actually laughed a short, ugly bark of sound. Montana. Girl, you will be dead inside a month. Go then. Save me the trouble of putting you out. And she walked past him as she had walked past him 3 days after the wedding, and she did not say goodbye. She went first to the cemetery. She knelt by her parents' graves. The grass was tall and the stones were weathered but still legible. Thomas Ellsworth, 1839 to 1886, faithful servant of the Lord. Martha Patterson, Ellsworth, 1844 to 1886, beloved wife and mother. Clara laid her hand on her mother's stone. She was very calm now. The quiet thing inside her chest, the candle that had gone out at the altar, had begun to burn again in a different way. A smaller flame, a harder one. Father, she said, I am going west. Pray for me from where you are. I will not dishonor your name, I promise. She rode the train 12 days across 8 states. She traveled third class on a wooden bench. She ate hard biscuits and drank water from station pumps and slept sitting up her head against the window, her trunk wedged between her feet. She watched Virginia roll away behind her and Kentucky rise ahead, and then the great flat brown of Missouri, and then Kansas, which was nothing but grass and sky, and then the long, slow climb of the prairie toward the mountains. She read her Bible. She watched her reflection in the dark window at night and tried to recognize it. She prayed without words. At Kansas City, the train stopped for 2 hours. Clara stepped down onto the platform to stretch her legs. A man came up behind her. He was drunk. He smelled of bad whiskey and old sweat. He began to say things to her in a low voice, things no gentleman in Charleston would ever have said to any woman, things that made her face burn. She stood very still and whispered the 23rd Psalm under her breath, and did not answer him. A hand came down on the drunk man's shoulder. It was a hard hand, weathered with old scars across the knuckles. The owner of the hand was a gray-haired soldier in a faded cavalry coat, perhaps 60 years old, straight-backed and very quiet. "You will step away from this lady," the soldier said. "You will do it now." The drunk man looked at him, weighed something in his mind, and went away. Clara's hands were shaking. "Thank you, sir," she managed. "Thank you." The soldier touched the brim of his hat. "Nathaniel Thorne, ma'am. Corporal, United States Cavalry, retired." He looked at her more closely. "Forgive me for asking, but you are traveling alone and young. Might I inquire your destination? Montana Territory, sir. A place called Hawks Ridge near Missoula." Something changed in the old soldier's face. Hawks Ridge. "Miss, would you be going to see a man named Caleb Hawk?" "Yes, sir. I am to be his wife." Corporal Thorne took off his hat. He stood there on the Kansas City platform with his hat in his hand, and he looked at Clara for a long moment. "I served with Caleb Hawk in Arizona," he said finally, "under General Crook, 1881 and 82, the Apache campaigns. He carried me half a mile with a bullet in my leg and a war party on our trail. There are men in this world I would trust, ma'am, and there are men in this world I would die beside, and Caleb Hawk is both. You are going to good men, but understand me plainly. They are men the war has wounded. They are men the wilderness has hardened. They will be slow to open and slower still to show you what is inside. Be patient with them. Earn their trust one day at a time. Do not expect easy speech or easy smiles, and do not ever let them think you are afraid even when you are." Clara felt tears rise in her eyes. She blinked them back. "Thank you, Corporal Thorne. I will remember that." The old soldier put his hat back on. Then he did something that surprised her. He reached into his inner coat pocket and took out a small brass medal on a faded blue ribbon. He pressed it into her hand. "I carried that through 3 campaigns," he said. "It has been lucky for me. You take it now. You give it to Caleb when you see him. Tell him Thorne says the debt is paid at last." He touched his hat again, and he walked away down the platform, and Clara never saw him again. She stood there with the brass medal in her palm, warm from his pocket, and she thought, "That is my sign, Lord. That is the sign I asked for." She rode on through Nebraska and across the high plains of Wyoming, and at last the train climbed into the mountain country and began to cross the Continental Divide. The air grew thin. The light grew sharper. The passengers thinned out as the miles passed until Clara was nearly alone in the car. And on the 12th day at noon, under a blue sky so huge it seemed to press down on the earth, the train pulled into the station at Missoula, Montana. She stepped down onto the platform with her trunk. She was wearing her traveling coat and her mother's bonnet. The wind struck her face. It smelled of pine resin and dust and something cold from the mountains far away. She looked around at the small frontier town, at the unpainted storefronts and the boardwalks, and the men in wide hats lounging against the hitching posts, and she felt very small and very far from Charleston. A young man was standing beside a rough wagon at the end of the platform. He was perhaps 26 tall, with copper-red hair that caught the sun and blue eyes the color of the Montana sky overhead. He saw her. He walked toward her slowly, almost shyly, and he took his hat off when he reached her. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, "I'm Ezekiel Hawk. My brothers call me Zeke." He glanced at her trunk. "May I take that for you, ma'am?" "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hawk." "Zeke," he said, and the smile that crossed his face was the first genuine smile she had seen in weeks. "Please, ma'am." "Just Zeke." He lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue to the team of bay horses, and the wagon rolled forward out of the dusty street of Missoula and onto the long road north. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Clara watched the land change. The valley floor gave way to rolling hills and dark stands of ponderosa pine, and beyond them the white peaks of the Bitterroots rose up like the wall of some ancient city. Zeke finally cleared his throat. "It's 3 days, ma'am. The ridge is a fair distance up. I hope that don't trouble you." "Not at all. Tell me about your brothers, if you would." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his words. "Caleb is the oldest," he said. "He's 36. He was a soldier in Arizona under General Crook fighting Apache. He came home hurt, an .82 bullet in his shoulder. He don't talk about it. He don't talk about much. But when Caleb Hawk gives you his word, ma'am, that word is iron. There's no bend in it. He's the one you're promised to, and I'll tell you plain, you could do a sight worse." Clara nodded. "And the second brother?" "Jedediah. Jed. He's 34. Jed is a hunter, the finest I've ever seen. He reads the woods the way you read a book. 6 winters ago, he got caught in a blizzard up in the Bitterroots, lost his horse, nearly froze. A Nez Perce girl named Running Deer found him, and her people took him in. He lived with them 3 years. He learned their language and their ways. He loved that girl, ma'am, and she died of smallpox before he could bring her home. So Jed is quiet. He's quiet like a stone is quiet. Don't take it for coldness. It ain't." "I will not," she said softly. "Samuel is the third brother. He's 30. Sam was a cattle drover down in Texas before we all came up to Montana. He's the one with the scar on his cheek from a fight in a cattle town. Sam is the loud one mostly. He laughs easier than the rest of us. But Sam had a wife, ma'am. Mary, some years back. Zeke's voice trailed off. He looked straight ahead at the horses. She was killed, he said. Her and the child she was carrying, 8 months along. It was a man called Silas Crow, a bandit, an enemy of our family from the old days. Sam was out on the range when it happened. He came home to ashes. He ain't been the same man since. He can laugh and he can joke, but there's a place in Sam that is closed up and dark, and you will see it sometimes. Do not ask him about Mary. If he ever tells you of her, it will be because he chose to, and that will be a great gift. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth. Lord have mercy, she whispered. The team moved on along the rutted road. A hawk circled far overhead. And you, Zeke? She asked gently. He smiled, but the smile was sadder now. Oh, I'm just the youngest, ma'am. I make things, furniture, horseshoes. I can put a roof on a cabin. I keep us fed when Jed ain't home with a deer. I read books by the fire at night, and the others pretend not to notice. He glanced at her. I'm glad you're coming, Miss Ellsworth. I ain't heard a woman's voice at our table in a very long time. They camped that night beside a small, cold creek. Zeke built a fire and cooked bacon and beans in a black skillet. He spread a bedroll for Clara on one side of the fire and laid his own on the other a respectful distance, and he slept with his rifle across his chest. Clara lay awake for a long time. She listened to the wind in the pines. She looked up at the stars, and she had never in her life seen so many thick as spilled salt across the black sky. She thought of Charleston and of Grace Baptist and of Wendell Shaw walking away from her at the altar. It all seemed very far away, very small, as if it had happened to another girl in another life. They traveled another day and another night. On the afternoon of the third day, the road turned and began to climb, and Zeke pointed ahead, and Clara saw it. Hawk's Ridge, a broad shoulder of the mountains spread with meadow grass crowned with a long, low house built of red pine logs weathered to gray. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. There was a barn behind the house, and a smokehouse, and a forge, and a small fenced garden. Black Angus cattle grazed on the slopes below. Beyond and above it all rose the Bitterroots, vast and white and silent. Clara caught her breath. It was beautiful in the way the first chapter of Genesis was beautiful. The world before people had spoiled it. 3 men stood on the porch waiting. The wagon came up the long track and stopped before the house, and Caleb Hawk stepped down off the porch. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired with a black beard cropped close in threads of gray at the temples. His eyes were the color of wet slate. He had the carriage of a man who had led other men into bad country and brought most of them home. He walked to the side of the wagon and offered her his hand. His hand was hard and dry and very steady. Miss Ellsworth, he said, welcome to Hawk's Ridge. Mr. Hawk, she said. Her voice did not shake. Thank you for bringing me. The second brother came forward behind him. Jedediah. He wore a deerskin shirt and soft moccasins, and his hair was long and tied back with a strip of leather. He did not offer his hand. He nodded once, grave and slow, and his dark eyes passed over her with the careful attention of a man who was trained to read whatever stood in front of him. Then he stepped back. The third brother came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Samuel. He had the white scar across his right cheekbone that Zeke had described, and his smile was wide and quick, but Clara saw in the first half-second that the smile did not reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, "a pleasure. We have been hoping you were real." "I am real, Mr. Hawk," she said, and she managed a small smile of her own. "Though I confess I am also very tired." "Of course you are," Caleb said. "Come inside." That evening at supper, Clara sat at the long pine table in the main room of the house, while Zeke served venison stew and cornbread. A fire burned in the stone hearth. The lamps were trimmed low, the walls were hung with antlers, and a cavalry saber, and a framed tintype of a woman in a dark dress, whom Clara understood without being told was the brother's mother. Caleb sat at the head of the table. Jed sat at his right, Samuel at his left, Zeke at the far end. Clara took the empty chair beside Zeke. Caleb bowed his head without a word. The other three bowed theirs. They waited. Clara understood with a small shock what they were waiting for. She folded her hands. "Our Father," she said quietly, "we thank Thee for this food, for this shelter, and for safe travel. We ask Thy blessing on this house and on those who dwell within it. Make us worthy, Lord, of the kindness we have received and the kindness we may yet give. In Jesus' name, Amen." "Amen," the four brothers said together. And Jed, the silent one, looked up at her for a long moment across the table, and for the first time she saw something move in his still dark eyes, something she would later understand had been grief, being touched by comfort for the first time in many years. They ate. Samuel asked about the journey and made easy conversation. Zeke laughed at his own jokes. Caleb spoke rarely but asked careful questions about her parents, about Charleston, about her faith. Jed did not speak at all, but once when she set down her water cup, he reached and refilled it from the pitcher without asking. A small thing. She noticed it. When the meal was finished, Caleb pushed his plate away. He drew a folded sheet of paper from his coat and laid it upon the table between them. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, "it is time we spoke of the agreement." She nodded. Her heart was beating, but her hands were still. "This is a contract," he said. "I wrote it out plain. You will read it, and if anything in it does not suit you, you will tell me and we will discuss it." She read. The terms were simple and they were honorable. She would marry Caleb Hawk lawfully before a minister in Missoula. She would keep the house cook, the meals, tend the garden. She would have a room of her own upstairs with a door that bolted from the inside. Not one of the four brothers would lay a hand upon her against her will. "We are not animals, Miss Ellsworth." That sentence was written in ink that had been pressed down hard. She read it twice. If after 1 year she wished to leave, they would pay her $300 in silver and escort her to Missoula and put her on any train she chose. No questions, no resistance. She looked up. 4 faces watched her, Caleb stern, Samuel curious, Zeke anxious, Jed unreadable as a stone wall. "I have one thing to add," she said. Caleb inclined his head. "I would ask that we pray at every meal in this house. I was raised to it. My father was a minister. I cannot eat a meal in silence. I will not press any man here to speak words he does not feel, but I would like to speak mine out loud at this table every day." Samuel glanced at Caleb. Zeke was already nodding, and then Jed the silent brother lifted his chin. He spoke for the first time since she had arrived, and his voice was low and rough, as if he used it rarely. "Our mother prayed at every meal," he said. "Since she died, no one has. I would like to hear it again." Clara felt tears gather. She blinked them away. "Then let it be so," she said. Caleb pushed the paper toward her. A quill and an inkwell stood at the center of the table. She dipped the quill. She signed her name in the long, graceful hand her mother had taught her. Clara Abigail Ellsworth. The ink glistened and then dulled. Caleb signed beneath her. Caleb Jacob Hawk. The contract was made. Outside, the sun had gone down behind the bitter roots, and the long Montana dusk was settling over the ridge. A wolf called somewhere far up the valley, and a second wolf answered it from farther still. Clara felt her heart turn toward the mountains. She did not know yet what lay ahead of her in this house, in this country, in this marriage. She did not know about the enemies that rode below in the valley dark. She did not know about the silver mine in Colorado, that her grandfather had left her a secret written inside the sealed rosewood box upstairs in her trunk. She did not know that Wendell Shaw and his father had already hired a detective, and that the detective had already reached St. Louis on a train headed west. She only knew that she had come a long way from Charleston, and that she had signed her name in ink, and that 4 men had bowed their heads when she had prayed. That night, Caleb himself carried her trunk up the narrow stairs to the room on the 2nd floor. The room had been his mother's. The bed was narrow iron-framed, covered with a clean quilt. There was a small writing table by the window, a washstand, an oil lamp, and a wooden cross carved of pine and fixed above the bed. Zeke had made the cross with his own hands in the week before she had arrived. Caleb did not mention that. "This was my mother's room," he said, standing in the doorway. "No one has slept here in 11 years. We cleaned it for you. If anything is not right, you tell me and we will fix it. It is perfect, Mr. Hawk." "Caleb, I beg your pardon." "Caleb, you are to be my wife. You may call me by my name. Then you must call me Clara." He nodded once, and something very faint passed across his face, perhaps the shadow of a smile. "Good night, Clara. Good night, Caleb." He closed the door. She heard his boots retreat down the hall, down the stairs. She stood alone in the lamplight in the small, quiet room on the 2nd floor of the house of 4 strange men on the edge of the Montana wilderness, and she pressed both hands against her chest and breathed. She knelt beside the bed. She prayed for a long time. She prayed for her father and mother in heaven. She prayed for Uncle Horace, which was hard. She prayed for Wendell Shaw, which was harder. She prayed for Caleb and Jedediah and Samuel and Ezekiel Hawk, the 4 strangers who were now her family. She asked the Lord to make her worthy of this house and of the prayer that had been waited for in it for 11 years. Below her, through the pine boards of the floor, Caleb Hawk sat alone in front of the dying fire. He heard the soft murmur of his promised wife's voice coming down through the ceiling, a sound he had not heard in this house since he was 25 years old, and his mother had still been alive. He closed his eyes. Something in his chest, a hard knot he had carried for more than a decade, shifted just slightly. Outside on the porch, Jed Hawk stood in the dark with his rifle cradled across his arm, watching the valley below. He was thinking about running deer. He was thinking about how she had once sung at the fire in a language he had never expected to hear again in this life. And he was thinking for the first time in 2 winters that perhaps the world was not finished with him yet. Out in the barn, Samuel Hawk had his forehead pressed against the flank of his favorite horse, and he was weeping quietly, the way a man weeps when he has held grief for 7 years, and something small has finally loosened it. And in the kitchen, young Zeke Hawk was washing the supper dishes with a towel over his shoulder, humming an old hymn he had not remembered. He knew a hymn his mother had sung to him when he was very small. The wolves called again from the far ridge. The stars came out thick above the bitter roots, more stars than Clara Ellsworth had ever seen in her life. And down in the valley, 9 miles below Hawk's Ridge, a single pinprick of lamplight moved slowly through the dark pines headed north. Someone was already coming. The first morning at Hawk's Ridge began before the sun. Clara woke in the iron-framed bed and lay still for a moment, uncertain where she was. Then she heard the soft sound of men's boots on the pine boards below the clink of a stove lid, the low murmur of voices, and she remembered. She was in Montana. She was assigned bride. The world she had left in Charleston might as well have been on the far side of the ocean. She rose. She dressed in her plainest gray dress and pinned her dark hair up behind her head. She took her mother's silver cross from where she had laid it on the writing table and fastened it at her throat. Then she opened the little rosewood box her mother had given her and took out the brass medal that Corporal Nathaniel Thorne had pressed into her palm in Kansas City. She had not yet given it to Caleb. She would today. The sign had been given, and she meant to honor the man who had given it. She went downstairs. The 4 brothers were at the long table with coffee and cold cornbread. They all looked up when she appeared. Samuel stood out of an old habit of manners. Zeke grinned. Jed nodded. Caleb rose more slowly than the others and pulled back her chair. "Clara," he said. "Caleb." She took the chair. "May I pour? There is a duty of the house I would like to begin at once, if you will permit me. The kettle is on the stove." She poured coffee for each of them in turn. She poured her own last. Then she sat and she folded her hands and she thanked the Lord for the morning and for the food and for the 4 men at this table. And when she said amen, the 4 men said amen with her, and something quiet and good settled into the long room that had been waiting 11 years to settle. After breakfast, she stopped Caleb at the door. She opened her hand. The little brass medal lay on her palm, the blue ribbon faded almost to gray. "A man gave this to me in Kansas City," she said. "He said to give it to you. His name was Corporal Nathaniel Thorne. He said the debt is paid at last." Caleb went very still. He looked at the medal. He looked at her. Then slowly he picked it up between his thumb and his finger and turned it over in the morning light. "Thorne," he said softly. His mouth moved into something that was almost a smile. "Old Nat Thorne. He is alive." "He is," Clara said. "He said you carried him half a mile with a bullet in his leg." Caleb closed his hand around the medal. He stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Thank you, Clara, for bringing this to me." And he walked out into the bright, cold air of the ridge. She watched him cross the yard to the barn. Zeke came up beside her with the empty coffee pot. "He don't show much, ma'am, but you just did him a kindness he won't forget." "I know," she said. She began to learn the house. Zeke taught her the iron stove, how to bank the coals at night so they would still be glowing at dawn, how to test the oven by holding her hand inside and counting seconds before the heat drove her out. He taught her to knead bread dough on the long pine table until it sprang back when she pressed it with 2 fingers. He showed her the smokehouse, the barrels of salted pork, the strings of dried apples hanging from the rafters, the crocks of sauerkraut his own mother had put up the last autumn of her life and which had never been opened. He showed her the spring box where butter and milk were kept cold in the creek water. She burned 3 loaves of bread in the first week. She scalded her wrist on the kettle. She cut her finger slicing venison for stew. She did not complain, and she did not cry. and by the end of the second week the bread came out golden, and the stew was rich, and the four brothers ate everything she put in front of them and left clean plates. Samuel taught her to ride. He brought out a gentle bay mare named Penny and saddled her in the yard, and watched Clara mount with the careful patience of a man who had spent his life around horses. She fell off twice in the first hour. The second time she landed hard on her shoulder and lay there in the dust looking up at the huge Montana sky. Samuel rode over to her. "You hurt, ma'am." "Only my pride, Mr. Hawk." He laughed. It was a real laugh this time. "Pride heals fast out here. Get up and try again." She got up. She tried again. Within a week she could sit the mare at a trot. Within a month she could canter along the ridge road. Samuel never once spoke down to her. He taught her to tell a horse's age by its teeth, to watch for the flick of an ear that meant the animal had heard something, she had not to check a hoof for stones before riding out. He taught her these things the way a brother teaches a sister patiently, without flirtation. And Clara understood that this was the only way Samuel Hawk knew how to be close to a woman anymore. Anything more would have been a betrayal of Mary. Jed taught her to read the ground. That was how he said it, not to track, to read. He took her out one cold morning into the edge of the pines above the house, and he crouched down and pointed at marks in the dust. "Bear," he said. "Black bear. 2 days old. Small. Likely a yearling moving fast." He moved 5 steps. "Deer. Mule deer doe. Yesterday evening." She stopped here to listen. She was afraid of something. He moved again. "Mountain lion. A week, maybe more. Big male crossing through." He looked up at her. "Out here you do not walk blind. You look down as often as you look up. And if you ever see fresh grizzly sign, you do not finish your errand. You turn around and you come home. There is no argument with a grizzly bear." "Yes," she said. He stood. He did not smile, but he nodded, and his nod meant, "You will learn." Caleb taught her to shoot. He brought out a small Colt single-action army revolver he had bought in Missoula the month before she had come. It was sized for a smaller hand. He had known then that she would need to defend herself one day. He had thought of her before she had ever signed her name. That realization moved her in a way she did not know how to speak. He set up tin cans on a fence rail 15 yards from the porch. He showed her the stance. He showed her how to breathe in, let half the breath out, hold and squeeze. Not pull, squeeze. She missed the first 6 shots. On the 7th, she clipped the rim of a can. On the 15th, she sent one spinning off the rail. Caleb grunted. By the end of the first week, she was hitting 2 out of 3 at 15 yards. By the end of the second week, she was hitting at 20. By the end of the third week, Caleb moved the cans to 30 yards and said nothing, and she hit 3 in a row, and he said good in the same quiet voice he had used when she had signed the contract. She found Jed at the creek one afternoon in the 3rd week. He was sitting on a flat rock with his back to the water, and in his hands he held a necklace of leather thongs strung with small brown beads and a single eagle feather. He was singing under his breath in a language she had never heard, low and slow, and full of a grief so old it had become something like a prayer. He heard her step and stopped. He moved to hide the necklace inside his shirt. "Please," she said softly, "do not stop on my account." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You may sit if you wish." She sat on the flat rock beside him, not too close. The creek ran cold and bright past their feet. Her name was Running Deer, he said. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the water. She was 19 years old. She found me in the snow. and she saved my life, and I lived 3 winters in her father's lodge. I learned her people's ways. I learned to speak her language. I meant to bring her back with me to this house to make her my wife under your God, because she had come to believe in him through my teaching, and because I had come to believe in many things through hers. She died of the smallpox 2 winters ago. I was with her at the end. This necklace was hers." Clara said nothing. She understood in the long way her father had taught her to understand that there were sorrows to which words only did damage. After a while, Jed said, "I have not sung that song aloud in this country. I did not think I ever would again." "Why did you today?" "Because you prayed at our table," he said, "and I had forgotten that a house can sound like a home." He put the necklace back inside his shirt. They sat together by the creek for perhaps 10 minutes. They did not speak again. When Clara rose to go, Jed rose with her, and he walked her the 1/4 mile back to the house, and he left her at the porch without a word and went on into the trees. That night at supper, for the first time, Jed spoke during the meal. He told a small story about a fox he had watched outsmart an owl. Samuel laughed. Zeke laughed. Caleb looked at Clara across the table, and he did not smile, but his slate-colored eyes rested on her for a breath longer than they needed to, and she understood what he was telling her. From that week forward, Jed began to leave small things at her door. A handful of blue lupine in a tin cup. A perfectly smooth white stone from the creek. Once a crude little carving of a rabbit no larger than her thumb, whittled out of pine wood. He never mentioned any of it. She never mentioned any of it. But she kept every one of them in the rosewood box beside her bed. The letter from Charleston arrived at the end of June. Caleb brought it up from Missoula along with a sack of flour and a new axe head. He laid it on the pine table after supper, without comment. Clara read the name on the envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, spidery, educated. The return address said, Langston, Charleston, South Carolina. She took the letter upstairs and read it in the lamplight of her room. The letter was from a man named Ambrose Langston, an attorney in Charleston. He had been engaged, he wrote, by a firm in Boston representing certain unnamed parties who wished to locate Miss Clara Abigail Ellsworth on an urgent matter concerning her late grandfather's estate. He begged her to reply at her earliest convenience care of his Charleston office. It was a polite letter, a careful letter, the kind of letter a wolf might send if the wolf had passed the bar. Clara folded the letter. She sat for a long time at the writing table with her hands flat on the cool wood. Then she went to her trunk and took out the little rosewood box her mother had given her on her deathbed. The red wax seal was still unbroken. "Open this only when thou art in true need." She broke the seal. Inside were 3 things. A yellowed envelope addressed in her father's hand. A single sheet of paper in her grandfather's hand dated February of 1870, and a small folded document on heavy stock embossed with the seal of the Leadville Assay Office of Colorado. She opened her father's letter first. "My beloved Clara, if you are reading this, then your mother and I are gone. There is a thing I never told you in life. Your grandfather, Ezra Patterson, your mother's father, was not only the gentle old man you remember from our Sunday dinners. Before he came to Charleston to live out his last years, he was one of the original investors in a silver mine in Leadville, Colorado, the Patterson strike. When he died in 1870, he left his shares in trust to you, his only granddaughter, 12% of the mine. At the time of his death, the shares were valued at $7,000. The mine has produced steadily since, and by the most recent assay statement I received before my own illness, the value of your share approaches $25,000. I kept this from you because I did not trust the men around your Uncle Horace, and because I feared what a young woman's life becomes when others know she is wealthy. The papers are lodged at the First Union Bank of Charleston under your name. They will be released upon presentation of your birth certificate and this letter, and upon your reaching majority, which you will have done by the time you read this. Use the money wisely, my child. Trust God. Trust your own good heart. We love you beyond all measure. Your father, Thomas Ellsworth. Clara read the letter twice. She read the grandfather's note. She read the assay document. She sat at the writing table for a long time. Then she went downstairs, and she asked Caleb and Zeke and Samuel and Jed to come to the kitchen, and she laid the 3 papers on the pine table in front of them. Caleb read slowly. He passed each page to Jed. Jed passed each page to Samuel. Samuel passed each page to Zeke. No one spoke until Caleb had finished. Then he looked up. Wendell Shaw did not leave you at the altar because he learned you had nothing. He said quietly, he left you because his father learned you had something, and the father is no longer willing to wait for a marriage contract to get at it. My God, Samuel said. Zeke was staring at the assay paper. $25,000, he whispered. Lord in heaven. Jed said nothing. Jed had already put his hand on the stock of his rifle where it leaned by the door. Caleb turned the pages over on the table. He folded his hands on top of them. Clara, he said, this changes nothing in this house. I want that said plain in front of my brothers. You are here because you signed a contract in good faith, and I signed one back to you in good faith. This money is yours. When the trouble is done, you will have it, and you will do with it what pleases you. Not one of us at this table is owed a penny of it. Do you hear me? I hear you, Caleb. But he said, and his voice was harder now, this also tells us what is coming. Shaw will not stop, nor will whoever he has hired. He looked at his brothers. They will come here. Let them come, Samuel said. The detective arrived 2 days later. He rode up the long track at mid-morning on a rented livery horse, a big man in a dark coat and a bowler hat, a cheap leather satchel strapped behind his saddle. He called out hello to the house from a polite distance, the way a man does who has heard stories about mountain families and wants to keep his skin. Caleb walked out to meet him. Samuel stood on the porch with his thumbs in his belt. Zeke stood inside the open doorway. Jed had vanished 10 minutes earlier into the pines above the yard, and the rider did not know it yet, but the long barrel of a Hawken rifle was resting on a pine limb at this moment, with its sights steady on his chest. The rider introduced himself as Reuben Carr, an attorney's agent out of Charleston, representing the interests of Mr. Horace Ellsworth, who was gravely concerned about the welfare of his niece. He said, urgent news concerning her inheritance. He asked most respectfully if he might speak with Miss Ellsworth. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She had her Colt in the pocket of her apron. Her hand was not on it, but she knew where it was. Mr. Carr, she said, my Uncle Horace put me out of his house 3 months ago with 2 weeks to find other arrangements. He has no standing to inquire about my welfare now. Anything he sent you for can be put into a letter and sent to the Missoula post office. I will not be going anywhere with you. Carr was smiling. It was a thin, careful smile. Miss Ellsworth, he said, did you know that Mr. Wendell Shaw and his father, Colonel Bartholomew Shaw, are presently in Missoula? They came a great distance to see you. They hope very much to resolve certain matters in person. Clara did not answer. Caleb answered. Mr. Carr, he said you have 30 seconds to turn that horse around and ride out of this yard. If I see you on my land again, I will shoot you where you stand. Carr's smile did not quite leave his face. He began to turn his horse. Then he paused, and he looked down at Caleb, and he said, "One last thing, Mr. Hawk, for your interest only. Did you know that Colonel Bartholomew Shaw once served alongside a man named Silas Crow down in Texas during the war? The colonel speaks of him with great fondness. I thought you might find it a curious coincidence." He turned the horse and rode out of the yard at a walk. He did not look back. Caleb did not move until the sound of the hooves had faded into the pines. Then he turned and walked into the house, and the family followed him, and he closed the door. No one spoke for a moment. "Bartholomew Shaw and Silas Crow," Samuel said at last, and his voice was the voice of a man who has just realized the grave he has been digging for 7 years is about to have another name cut into the stone. They served together. Crow was a raider in the Confederate cavalry down on the Texas border. Shaw was an officer. They must have known each other then. "It is worse than that," Caleb said. "Crow did not attack our place in Colorado by accident. He did not know we were the Hawks by chance. Someone sent him. Shaw was already after the Patterson shares then. Grandfather Ezra had died that winter. The mine had begun to pay out. Shaw wanted the money. He could not touch Clara directly, she was a child. So he used Crow to clean the ground, to scatter anyone who might stand in his way when the time came to marry his son into that family. Mary. The child. My father, too, before he passed. All of it is on Shaw's hand." Samuel sat down slowly at the table. He put his face in his hands. He did not cry. It was worse than crying. It was the stillness of a man who has just understood that his wife's death was not an accident of savage country, but a calculation on a ledger somewhere in a fine house in Charleston. Jed came in through the back door. He had heard it all from the wall. He set his rifle against the door frame. He walked to Samuel and put one hand on his brother's shoulder and did not take it off for a long time. Clara stood by the window with her arms wrapped around herself. "Lord," she whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Caleb went to Missoula 3 days later. He took Samuel with him. They rode in at dusk and stabled their horses at the livery and walked down the boardwalk to the Silver Dollar Saloon, which was where news moved in that town. Samuel went to the bar. Caleb took a table in the back corner with his back to the wall. They ordered coffee and whiskey, and they listened. They heard things. They heard that a fine gentleman and his son had taken the 2 best rooms at the Montana Hotel. They heard that the gentleman had been asking about Hawks Ridge. They heard that he had been seen 2 nights in a row in the back room of the Silver Dollar with a gray-haired man in a long coat, a man with pale eyes and a queer, slow way of speaking, a man who was not from Missoula and who did not give his name. Samuel set his whiskey down and looked across the room at Caleb. Caleb had already seen him. Silas Crow was sitting at a corner table with 2 other men. He had not looked up yet. He was older than Caleb remembered from the Colorado days, his hair gone to iron gray, but the face was the same, the long jaw and the pale eyes and the thin mouth that never quite closed. Wendell Shaw stood up from the same table. Wendell had been sitting there the whole time, and Caleb had not recognized him. The whiskey had changed his face. He had been drinking hard and often for days. Wendell saw Samuel at the bar. He did not know Samuel, but he saw the scar on Samuel's cheek, and he saw the hardness of Samuel's eyes, and something in his drunken mind guessed. He pointed. "Hawk," he said loudly. "That is a hawk." His voice carried across the room. "You, Hawk, where is my wife? Where is Clara?" The saloon went quiet, the way a saloon goes quiet when men understand that the next sound will be gunfire. Samuel turned slowly from the bar. "She was never your wife, coward," he said, "and she never will be." One of the men at Crow's table, a thick-shouldered man in a black coat with a silver cross etched on his hatband, stood up and drew. He was fast, but Samuel had been waiting for him since the moment he had walked through the door, and Samuel was faster. Samuel's bullet took him in the chest and dropped him behind the table. The second man at the table drew on Caleb. Caleb shot him through the gun hand. The man screamed and fell. Wendell Shaw turned and ran for the back door. Caleb went after him. He crossed the saloon in 4 long strides. He burst through the back door into the alley. He saw Wendell's coat turning the corner at the far end of the alley, running for the livery. He started after him. And that was when the third man, the one Caleb had not seen, the one who had been waiting in the shadow of the back stairway of the saloon, stepped out behind him and struck him hard across the back of the skull with the butt of a pistol. Caleb went down to one knee. The world tilted. Blood ran hot down his neck into his collar. He heard the third man speak very close behind him in a dry, cold voice he had not heard in 7 years, but had never once forgotten. Hawk said, "Silas Crow, I have been waiting a long time for this." Crow lifted the pistol for a second blow. The gunshot from the saloon door was very loud in the narrow alley. The bullet from Samuel's Winchester took Crow high on the shoulder and spun him against the alley wall. He did not fall. He staggered. He cursed. He fired back wildly, and his bullet struck sparks off the stones behind Samuel's head. Then Crow turned and ran, clutching his shoulder, and disappeared into the dark between the buildings. Samuel did not pursue. He ran instead to Caleb. "Caleb, Caleb, get up, brother." Caleb got up. The blood was in his eyes. Samuel pulled him along the boardwalk and back to the livery, and somehow got both horses saddled with one hand while holding Caleb upright with the other, and they rode out of Missoula at a hard gallop under the rising moon, and they did not stop until they had climbed 10 miles into the foothills of the Bitterroots. Only then did Samuel let Caleb slide down from the saddle beside a cold mountain stream. Caleb sat on a rock and pressed his bandana against the wound at the back of his head, and the bandana soaked through in less than a minute. "Gotta get you home," Samuel said. "Gotta get you home now." They rode the rest of the way through the night. Caleb did not speak. He held on to the saddle horn with both hands, and he did not speak, and twice Samuel had to catch him before he fell. They came up the long track to the house in the gray hour before dawn, and Zeke was on the porch with a lantern before they had crossed the last pasture, and Clara was in the yard in her shawl before the horses had stopped, and when she saw Caleb's face under the dried black blood, she did not scream. She did not faint. She said one word. "Zeke." "Yes, ma'am." "Boil water. All you have. Now." "Samuel." "Yes, ma'am." "Whiskey. The strongest you have in the house, and clean linen torn into strips, and bring me the sewing kit from the top drawer of my writing table, the small one." "Yes, ma'am." "Jed." "Yes. Sit at the door with your rifle. Let no one come near this house tonight but the brothers." "Yes." She had Caleb on the long pine table in the kitchen within 5 minutes. She cut the hair away from the wound with her sewing scissors, steadily, a 1/4 inch at a time. She washed the wound with boiling water and whiskey. Caleb's body jerked once and then went still, and he made no sound at all. She threaded a needle with thin gut thread, the way her father's old doctor friend had shown her one long summer afternoon when she was 14 years old and had wanted to learn what a minister's daughter ought to know about mending the bodies of the poor. She stitched. 14 stitches. Her hands did not shake. When she was done, she wrapped the head in clean linen, and she bound it tight, and she looked up at the three brothers standing around the table, and she said, "He will live. He has lost blood, but the skull is not broken. He will have fever for a day or two. One of us must sit with him through every hour. I will take the first watch." She sat with him through the first night. She sat with him through the second day and the second night. She did not sleep. She wiped his face with cool cloths when the fever rose. She prayed psalm after psalm under her breath. She read to him from the book of Ruth out loud, because the book of Ruth was the book that had brought her to him, and because she wanted the words of it to be in his ears, whether he could hear or not. On the second night, very late, Caleb opened his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment in the dim yellow light of the oil lamp. "Clara," he whispered, "I am here." "Why did you not run?" he said. "You could have gone out the back. You could have gone anywhere. Why did you stay?" She reached for his hand. She took it in both of hers. She bent and pressed her forehead against his knuckles. "Because I signed my name Caleb Hawke," she said, "and because I am an Ellsworth, we do not leave people behind. And because," she said, and her voice dropped to a whisper, "I love you." His fingers closed on hers. He did not answer. He did not need to. He closed his eyes again and fell into a clean, deep sleep for the first time since Missoula, and she sat in the chair beside him with his hand in both of hers. And she stayed awake the rest of that night, and she was smiling, though the tears ran down her face without stopping. He began to mend. On the fourth day he could sit up. On the sixth he could walk to the porch. On the eighth he came to supper and said the blessing himself in a low, rough voice, and Jed looked at him down the length of the table, and Jed's eyes were wet, and no one remarked on it. They thought the worst had passed. They were wrong. It was 9 days after Caleb came home that Zeke went down to the creek at dawn to fetch water. He did not come back by breakfast. Samuel walked down to look for him at mid-morning. He found the wooden yoke and the 2 oaken buckets at the water's edge. One bucket had been kicked over. There was a small, dark smear on a flat stone beside it. There were boot prints in the wet sand, 4 sets deep, recently made. There were hoof prints in the bank above the creek leading east. Samuel ran back to the house. Jed was saddling a horse before Samuel had finished speaking. Caleb, still pale from his wound, was reaching for his rifle with hands that had to be willed steady. An hour after that, a barefoot boy from Missoula rode into the yard on a spent mule. He had been paid $5 to bring a letter. He handed it to Caleb, and he would not come down off the mule. The letter was written in a sharp hand and unsigned. "Hawke, we have your youngest. If you want him back in one piece, bring the woman to Eagles Pass at dawn on Saturday. She comes alone. She comes unarmed. She walks in on foot. If you try to send anyone with her, or if you follow her at any distance, we will return your brother to you over the course of the next week, and he will not come back whole." Clara read the letter over Caleb's shoulder. She put one hand on the back of a chair to steady herself. Then she straightened up. She folded the letter. She walked to the corner of the kitchen where her Colt hung on a peg in her apron. She took it down. She checked the cylinder. She checked the spare cartridges. She looked up at the 3 men of her house. "I am going," she said. "No," Samuel said. "I am going," she said again more quietly, "but not the way they think, and not alone." Caleb was looking at her with a stillness that was almost prayer. "Speak," he said. She set the revolver on the table. They expect a frightened girl on foot, unarmed, walking into a narrow canyon at first light. That is what they have asked for. That is what they will watch for. So that is what they will see. I will ride to the mouth of Eagles Pass. I will tie the horse out of sight. I will walk in alone on foot. I will not be unarmed, but I will carry the pistol where they cannot see it." She paused. "But you," she said, looking at Jed, "will be above me on the north rim with your rifle before the sun comes up. And you, Samuel, will be above me on the south rim, and you, Caleb, will be behind me in the rocks at the mouth of the pass, low where they cannot see from within. You will be my shadow. I will walk in alone. I will keep them talking. I will keep their eyes on me, and when the moment is right I will give you a sign, and then we will take our brother back." "What is the sign?" Caleb asked. "I will take off my bonnet," she said. "When my bonnet comes off, that is the moment. Before that, nothing. No matter what they say to me, no matter what they do. Do you understand?" "No," Samuel said, and his voice cracked on the word. "No, Clara. If they touch you, if Crow is there, if Wendell—" She crossed the kitchen. She put her hand on Samuel's scarred cheek the way a sister might. She looked up into his face. "Samuel Hawke," she said, "they took Mary from you. They took your child. They have been taking from this family for 7 years. They have taken the one brother I am the least afraid of losing, because Zeke has the kindest heart any of you have, and they chose him for exactly that reason. I am done being what they expect me to be. I came to this house as a girl who was left at an altar. I am not that girl anymore. Your mother raised 4 men in this house. Your father gave them a name. I am going to carry that name into that canyon on Saturday morning, and I am going to bring Ezekiel Hawke home." Samuel stared down at her. Then Samuel Hawke, who had not wept for a woman in 7 years, put his forehead down against the shoulder of the preacher's daughter from Charleston, and he wept. Caleb turned to his brothers. "Ride," he said. "Ride every cabin in the East Valley, every line camp, every line rider we know. I want to know where Eagles Pass is being watched from right now. I want to know how many men. I want to know where their horses are tied. By Friday night. Go." They went. They were gone the rest of that day and all the next. That night Clara stood on the porch in the cold. The stars were very bright. Caleb came out behind her. He did not touch her. He stood at her shoulder and looked at the same stars. "If anything happens to you in that canyon," he said at last, "I will not survive it, Clara." "You will," she said, "because you have Samuel and Jed and Zeke, and because you are a man who survives. Not this," he said, "not you." She turned to him. She lifted her hand and she laid it flat against his chest over his heart on the wool of his shirt. She felt the steady, strong beat of it under her palm. He was warm. He was alive. He was hers. "Caleb Jacob Hawke," she said, "when this is finished and Ezekiel is home and the Shaws are gone, I want a true wedding in this house, not a paper in Missoula. A minister on that porch, and your brothers beside you, and my mother's dress on my shoulders. Will you have me, Caleb, not because of a contract, because I have come to love you more than I knew I was able?" He did not speak for a long moment. Then he put his hands on her shoulders. He drew her to him, and he laid his chin on the top of her head, the way a man lays his chin on the head of a thing he is afraid to break, and he stood there with her in the cold Montana night, and finally he said the only word he had to give. Yes. Out in the valley, 9 miles below Hawk's Ridge, the small pinprick of lamplight moved again through the dark pines. This time it was moving east toward Eagles Pass. It was no longer alone. 4 lights moved with it now, strung out along the trail like a row of slow, cold stars. Saturday was 2 nights away. Jed and Samuel came home Friday night at the hour when the stars had begun to sharpen in the cold black sky above the Bitterroots. They rode in without speaking. They unsaddled their horses in the barn by lantern light, and they came into the kitchen and they laid a folded piece of brown butcher paper down on the pine table in front of Caleb and Clara. On the paper, Jed had drawn the canyon in charcoal lines. He had marked 8 crosses upon it in 3 positions. 8 men, Jed said. 4 at the floor of the pass near the narrow part. They are holding Zeke there tied at the base of a dead pine. 2 on the east shelf of the north rim behind a stand of scrub juniper. They have rifles and a spyglass. 2 with the horses a quarter-mile back up the trail behind a fold of rock. Wendell Shaw is with the group at the canyon floor. His father, the colonel, is with the rifles on the north rim. Crow himself is at the canyon floor with Wendell. I saw him with my own eyes through the glass. His left arm is in a sling from Samuel's bullet, but he can still shoot with his right. Caleb looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. Then he put his finger on one of the crosses on the north rim. "This one here," he said. "That is where I go." "Yes," Jed said. Samuel put his finger on the other one. "This one is mine." "Yes," Jed said again. "And I," Jed said, "will be on the south rim with the Hawken. I will be above the canyon floor. I will be the one who takes Crow when Clara gives the sign. The Hawken rifle is the oldest weapon in this house. It was our father's. It has waited a long time for this day." Clara laid her hand flat on the paper. She did not tremble. "When my bonnet comes off," she said, "you begin." "When your bonnet comes off," Caleb said, "we end it." They did not sleep that night. Clara went upstairs and knelt beside the narrow iron bed where Caleb's mother had slept. She prayed for an hour. Then she rose and she opened her trunk and she took out her mother's wedding dress. She laid it flat across the quilt. She looked at it for a long time in the lamplight, the yellowed silk, the lace at the collar that had once been her mother's christening gown. She did not weep. She closed the trunk. She blew out the lamp. She lay down fully dressed upon the quilt beside the dress, and she watched the dark sky outside her window turn slowly from black to the deep cold blue that comes before a summer dawn in Montana. At 4 in the morning she rose. She washed her face in the basin. She braided her hair. She put on her plain gray traveling dress and her black bonnet, and she fastened her father's silver cross at her throat under the collar where no one could see it. She loaded her Colt single-action army with 6 fresh cartridges. She slid the revolver into the inside pocket of her traveling coat, where the weight of it rested against her ribs like a promise. She went downstairs. 3 men were waiting for her in the kitchen in the dark. No lamp was lit. They did not need one. Caleb walked to her. He did not speak. He bent his head and he pressed his mouth to her forehead and held it there for one long breath. Then he stepped back. Jed walked to her. He did not speak either. He took the beaded leather necklace with the eagle feather from inside his shirt, the last thing he had of running deer, and he lifted it and placed it around Clara's neck and tucked it beneath the collar of her coat where no one could see it. Samuel walked to her last. Samuel bent, and Samuel kissed her on the top of her head, the way a brother kisses a sister he is sending into the teeth of something he cannot follow her into, and Samuel said, "You bring our boy home, Clara Hawk." "Yes," she said, "I will." They rode out of the yard in the black hour before dawn. They split at the first fork. Jed turned his horse south. Samuel turned his north. Caleb rode at Clara's side along the dark road east toward Eagle's Pass, not speaking his Winchester across his saddle. When they reached the last rise before the canyon mouth, The eastern sky had begun to pale. Caleb dismounted. He walked to the head of Clara's horse. He took her hand and helped her down, and he tied her mare to a stunted cedar out of sight behind a granite boulder. He looked at her. "I am going up into those rocks now," he said, pointing at a shoulder of stone above the canyon mouth. "I will be 20 yards behind you the whole time. You will not see me, but I will see you." "I have you, Clara." "I know," she said. "Walk slow. Keep them talking. When the sun hits the top of the north rim, that will be when the light is right for Jed's shot. Not before. Do you understand? When the sun touches the rim, my bonnet comes off." "Yes." He kissed her one more time. Then he climbed up into the rocks with his Winchester and disappeared as completely as a shadow passes into deeper shadow. Clara stood alone on the trail. She drew one long, slow breath of the cold pine air of Montana. She began to walk. She walked into Eagle's Pass as the first gray light touched the high stones above her. The canyon narrowed quickly, the two walls of rock closing in until she could almost have touched both of them with outstretched hands. The floor was sand and broken shale. Her boots made a soft scraping sound that was very loud in the silence. She walked with her head up and her hands empty at her sides. She walked through the valley of the shadow, and she was afraid, and she was not afraid both at once, and beneath her collar, her father's silver cross rested warm against her skin. She saw Zeke first. He was tied at the base of a dead pine 30 yards ahead, his hands bound behind the trunk, his mouth gagged with a strip of gray cloth. His face was bruised. His left eye was swollen closed. There was dried blood on his shirt, but he was alive. He saw her coming, and his one good eye went wide, and he began to shake his head violently against the gag, trying to scream into it, trying to tell her to run. She walked past him. She did not look at him. Looking at him would have broken her. 4 men were waiting in the center of the canyon floor. Wendell Shaw stood in front, pale and trembling, a pistol held loosely in his right hand. Beside him stood a gaunt, iron-haired man in a long coat with his left arm in a sling. Silas Crow. 2 other men, hired guns, stood behind them with rifles held across their chests. 20 yards away, Clara stopped. She folded her hands in front of her the way she had folded them at prayer 1,000 times in the front pew of Grace Baptist. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried up the canyon walls. Wendell stepped forward. "You came," he said. His voice was cracked and raw from whiskey. "You actually came. Clara, I knew you would. I knew you were still reasonable. I came for the boy," she said. "Untie him, now." Wendell laughed. It was a thin, ugly laugh. "The boy comes home when you come home, Clara. With me. A carriage is waiting on the other side of this pass. We will go to Helena. There is a magistrate there. You will sign certain papers, the inheritance, a transfer of guardianship to my father since your uncle has so unfortunately been unable to manage you. A formal marriage finally, and then once the business is properly concluded, we will see about the boy." Silas Crow had said nothing yet. He was staring at Clara with pale, unblinking eyes. His right hand rested on the butt of the revolver at his hip. He was waiting. He was watching the canyon walls behind her, the way a wolf watches a tree line, not because he had seen anything, but because he had lived long enough to know that something was always there. Clara did not look at the canyon walls. She looked at Wendell Shaw. "Wendell," she said, "do you remember what you said to me at the altar?" His mouth worked. He did not answer. "You told me," she said, "that your father had just learned I had nothing, not a single dollar. You could not do it. Those were your words. I stood in my mother's wedding dress, and I heard them. Do you remember Wendell? Clara. Your father lied to you, Wendell. I did have something. I had a great deal. Your father knew it. He had known it for years. He used you. He used me. He used Silas Crow here, whom he has known since the war. He used a man named Reuben Carr, whom he sent to my house. He used my poor, weak uncle Horace, who is a foolish man, but not a cruel one, and who did not know what he was part of. Your father has been playing this long, slow game since my grandfather died 20 years ago. And you, Wendell, you were only ever a little painted piece on his board. Wendell's pistol hand had begun to shake. No, he said. No, that is not. She took one slow step closer. Look at me, Wendell Shaw. Look at me. I am standing in the same dress I traveled west in. There is no ring on my finger. There is no veil on my head. There never will be. Not for you. I was raised by a minister of the gospel. I was taught that a man is known by his word. You broke your word to me in front of God and 300 souls in Charleston. There is no altar left between us, Wendell. There is only this canyon, and you are standing on the wrong side of it. Silas Crow spoke for the first time. His voice was dry as a stone rattling down a dry creek. Boy, he said quietly to Wendell, shut your mouth. Girl, take 2 more steps and stop. Clara took 2 more steps and stopped. Crow was looking up now. He had seen something at last. A flicker of movement on the south rim, a glint, perhaps the corner of a sight catching the first light. His right hand began to move. The sun at that instant crested the north rim of Eagle's Pass and struck the top of the south wall with a clean, clear gold. The light came down the canyon wall like water pouring. Clara reached up with both hands. She untied the black ribbon beneath her chin. She lifted her bonnet from her head. From the south rim, a single shot cracked, and the report rolled down the stone walls like thunder, unrolling out of a long, cold throat. The big round ball from Jed Hawk's Hawken rifle, the rifle that had belonged to his father and to his grandfather before him, struck Silas Crow high in the center of his chest. Crow took 1 step backward. His pale eyes found the south rim and seemed to understand for one last instant who had been waiting for him there. Then the life went out of him, and he folded at the knees and went down into the sand of the canyon floor, and he did not rise. 7 years of waiting were finished. From the rocks to Clara's left, Caleb Hawk rose up with his Winchester already at his shoulder, and Caleb's first shot took the nearer of the 2 hired rifles in the thigh and dropped him howling. From the north rim above Samuel's shot took the second hired rifle cleanly in the shoulder, and he fell behind a rock and did not come up. Clara dropped her bonnet into the sand. Her right hand found the butt of the Colt in her coat pocket. She drew. Wendell Shaw was already swinging his pistol toward her face. He was 10 yards away, and his eyes were huge and white, and his mouth was open in a cry of outrage, and Clara leveled the Colt the way Caleb Hawk had taught her on the fence rail at Hawk's Ridge, and she breathed in, and she let half the breath out, and she held, and she squeezed. Wendell Shaw's pistol went sideways out of his hand, and he sat down very hard in the canyon sand, with both hands pressed to his right shoulder, weeping like a child. Up on the north rim, there was the sharp, dry sound of a rifle being thrown down onto rock, and Colonel Bartholomew Shaw stepped out from behind the juniper with his hands lifted high above his head. I yield, he called down his voice, a thin reed across the cold canyon air. I yield. Do not shoot. I yield to the law. I am unarmed. Samuel was on him in 30 seconds. He bound the colonel's hands behind his back with a length of saddle rope, and he did not speak one word to him, because Samuel Hawke knew that if he spoke to this man, he would kill him, and so he did not speak. He pushed the old colonel down onto a rock and stood behind him with the Winchester and watched the canyon floor. Clara ran. She ran across the broken shale and the sand and the blood, and she fell to her knees at the base of the dead pine where Zeke Hawke was tied. She cut the gag away from his mouth with her small sewing knife. She cut the ropes from his hands. She cut the ropes from his ankles. Zeke pitched forward into her arms, and he was shaking, and his face was pressed against her shoulder, and he was trying to speak, and could not. And she held him the way she would have held her own brother if she had ever had one. "I am here," she said against his hair. "I am here, Ezekiel. You are safe. I have you. I have you." Caleb reached them a moment later and dropped to his knees beside them and wrapped them both in his arms at once, Clara and Zeke together, and he did not speak for a long time. He only held them. Behind him, in the sand of the canyon floor, Silas Crow lay with his pale eyes fixed on the thin strip of blue sky above Eagle's Pass, and the eyes saw nothing now, and the long shadow that had followed the Hawke family for 7 winters had at last passed on. They brought Wendell Shaw and Colonel Bartholomew Shaw out of Eagle's Pass alive. The 2 hired riflemen were loaded onto a pack horse, wounded but alive as well. The one Jed had shot was dead where he had fallen, and they left him there for the federal marshal to collect. They rode down out of the canyon in the bright, cold noon of that Saturday, and they rode all the way to Missoula without stopping. And at the sheriff's office in Missoula, they handed Wendell Shaw and Bartholomew Shaw over to Federal Marshal Henry Dawson of Helena, who had received their letter the week before and had ridden up with 4 deputies and was waiting for them. The federal trial was held in Helena 3 months later, in October of 1889, in the first month that Montana was formally a state of the Union rather than a territory. Clara and the 4 Hawke brothers went down to Helena in the wagon. They stayed at a boarding house near the courthouse. The trial lasted 6 days. The evidence against Colonel Bartholomew Shaw was overwhelming. Thomas Ellsworth's sealed letter to Clara, Grandfather Ezra Patterson's notes on the Leadville shares, the assay documents, Reuben Carr, who had been arrested in St. Louis trying to board a train for Canada, testified against the colonel in exchange for a lighter sentence on his charges of conspiracy. A journal taken from Bartholomew Shaw's hotel room in Missoula, written in his own hand, contained dated entries going back to 1870, detailing his correspondence with Silas Crow, his plans for the Patterson shares, and a short and terrible note from the spring of 1882. The note read in the colonel's own script, "Colorado business to be concluded by Crow this month. Hawke Ranch to be scattered. Widow and child to be removed. We will speak no more of it." Samuel Hawke sat in the front row of the courtroom when that page was read out. He did not weep. His face was as still as stone, but his right hand resting on the arm of the bench tightened slowly until the knuckles were white, and Clara, sitting beside him, covered his hand with her own and did not let go of it until the bailiff had taken the paper away. Colonel Bartholomew Shaw was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and criminal collusion. He was sentenced to 25 years in the federal penitentiary at Deer Lodge. He was 63 years old when the sentence was handed down. He would die in prison 8 winters later. He never spoke a word of remorse. Wendell Shaw was convicted of kidnapping, attempted murder, and accessory to fraud. He was sentenced to 15 years at Deer Lodge. When the sentence was read, he turned in the dock and looked at Clara across the courtroom. He was weeping. He mouthed the word, "Please." She held his gaze for a long, quiet moment. Then she turned her face away. She would not see him again in this life. The Leadville shares were confirmed in Clara's name by the federal court. The full value was transferred into a bank account under her name at the First Bank of Missoula in early November, $25,418. She did not keep most of it. She used $5,000 to rebuild and expand the main house at Hawks Ridge, adding a proper parlor and 2 extra bedrooms and a covered dog trot between the kitchen and the smokehouse. She used $4,000 to build a small second cottage on the ridge, 1/4 mile from the main house, tucked into a grove of young pines with its own stone hearth and its own little garden plot. She did not say at the time who the cottage was for. She used $1,000 to buy Samuel a pair of thoroughbred breeding mares from an estate in Kentucky because Samuel had always wanted to raise fine horses and had never been able to afford to. She used $700 to buy Zeke every woodworking tool in the catalog of a fine carpentry house in Chicago. She used $200 to buy Jed a new Hawken rifle identical to the old one so that the old one might hang above the hearth and be honored. She sent $3,000 to Federal Marshal Henry Dawson to establish a fund for the widows and orphans of families who had been victimized by border violence in Montana and Idaho. The rest, $15,000, and some change she placed in a trust for Caleb and Clara Hawk and the children, if God should bless them with children, that would yet come. On a cold, clear afternoon late in November, Caleb Hawk asked Clara to walk with him. They climbed together to the crest of Hawk's Ridge to the old lone pine that Jacob Hawk, his father, had planted with his own hands the year the family had first come to the Bitterroots. The valley lay below them in the late autumn light, gold and brown and gray. The Bitterroots stood white and huge to the west. A thin, cold wind came down from the peaks. Caleb turned to her beneath the old pine. He took off his hat. He dropped to one knee in the long yellow grass at her feet. "Clara Abigail Ellsworth," he said, "the paper we signed in May was an honest paper, but I cannot live inside it any longer. I want to be your husband not because of ink on a page, but because I have come to love you more than I ever knew I could love anything in this world. I want to stand with you before God, and before your mother's memory, and before my brothers, and before whatever good neighbors will come up this mountain to witness it. I want to say the old words, and mean every one of them, and I want you to say them back to me if you can. Will you marry me, Clara? Truly." A second time. A true time. She bent to him. She put her hands on his face. "Yes, Caleb Hawk. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." They were married on the front porch of the main house at Hawks Ridge on the second Saturday of December in 1889. Reverend Elijah Hawthorne came up from Missoula to perform the ceremony. He was a white-bearded old man with kind, tired eyes, and when Clara had given him her father's full name at their first meeting in Missoula, the old minister had sat down abruptly on a bench outside his chapel and had covered his face with both hands. "I knew your father, child," he had said when he could speak again. "Thomas Ellsworth and I were at seminary together in Richmond before the war. I have not heard his name spoken aloud in 22 years. I will marry you myself, and I will take no fee for it. It would be my great honor." So it was that Reverend Elijah Hawthorne, who had sat at table with her father when her father was a young man, stood on the porch at Hawks Ridge and opened his Bible and read the old words over Clara Ellsworth and Caleb Hawke. She did not wear her mother's white wedding dress. She had thought long about it, and she had decided. The white dress belonged to the girl who had stood in Grace Baptist. That girl was gone. She had been buried in Eagles Pass with her pride and her shame together, and only a new woman had walked out of the canyon that summer morning. Clara wore instead a gown of deep sky blue wool that her mother-in-law would have chosen for her had her mother-in-law been alive to choose it, and which Zeke and Samuel had ridden 2 days to Helena to buy for her. Zeke made her bouquet from dried blue lupine and white yarrow and small cones of ponderosa pine. Samuel played his fiddle on the porch after the ceremony, and what he played was Amazing Grace, a hymn he had not played in 7 years because it had been his Mary's favorite, and when he finished playing it, he laid the fiddle gently on the railing of the porch, and he walked down into the yard, and he knelt for a long time in the frozen grass, with his face in his hands, and no one disturbed him, because they understood that what was happening inside him was a thing between Samuel Hawke and the Lord, and no one else. Jed fired 3 shots from the new Hawken rifle into the cold blue winter sky to announce the wedding to the mountain, and he said quietly, as the 3rd echo faded, "My mother and my father, bless this house today." 37 people were there, neighbors from 3 valleys, Corporal Nathaniel Thorne, who had ridden up from his daughter's homestead in Wyoming when Caleb had written to him, Marshall Dawson of Helena, old Miss Abigail from the general store in Missoula, who had sold Clara flour every month since summer and had come to love her. The Reverend Hawthorne performed the ceremony. Caleb spoke his vows in a voice that was low and rough and perfectly clear, and at the words, "Until death do us part." He did not look at the Bible or at the Reverend. He looked into Clara's face, and he meant every word exactly. Clara spoke hers in the clear soprano she had sung hymns in since childhood. When she reached the words, "Whither thou goest, I will go," she smiled through her tears, because those were the words she had written to Caleb in her very first letter from Charleston, and both of them knew it, and both of them knew that the 7 months between that letter and this porch had been the longest and strangest and greatest journey of her life. The second letter from Charleston came in late January of 1893, weeks after the wedding. It was the letter that changed everything Clara thought she knew about her own past. The letter was from Dr. Ambrose Langston, the Charleston physician. She read it alone in the bedroom she now shared with Caleb, and when she was done reading it, she walked out of the bedroom with her face very pale, and she sat down on the stairs, and she could not rise. Caleb found her there 10 minutes later. He carried her downstairs in his arms and laid her on the settle by the hearth and called for Zeke to bring brandy. She told them what the letter said. The letter said that in the yellow fever summer of 1886, Martha Ellsworth had not died. Dr. Langston had been the physician of record for both her parents in their final illness. Her father, Thomas, had truly died in the first week of the fever, but her mother, Martha, had fallen into a deep fever coma and had lingered. Uncle Horace Ellsworth, newly in charge of his brother's estate, had forged a death certificate for Martha on the 6th day of her coma in order to claim the last of his brother's life insurance and the trust accounts that were designated for her care. 6 months after the funeral, Clara had attended. Martha had woken. She had lost her speech for a year. She had lost significant memory. She had never fully understood why she had not died and why her daughter had not come for her. Uncle Horace had placed her in a charitable sanatorium on the outskirts of Charleston, and had quietly paid a monthly fee to the matron to keep the secret. Dr. Langston had only learned the truth 3 months ago, when one of the nurses of that sanatorium had come to him with a conscience she could no longer live with. He had taken Martha into his own household at once. She was largely recovered now, speaking clearly again, her memory much restored. She was asking every day for her daughter Clara. Uncle Horace had been arrested on charges of fraud and unlawful confinement and was presently awaiting trial. Dr. Langston begged Clara to come to Charleston as soon as she was able. They traveled east in the first week of February. Clara, Caleb, Jed, Samuel, and Zeke. All of them. The Hawk brothers would not let their sister go east alone, and Clara understood with a deep warmth in her chest that she had not been called sister by any of them out loud, but that was what she had become. They rode 6 days by rail. They arrived in Charleston at dusk on a mild winter evening, and they went straight from the depot to Dr. Langston's handsome brick house on Meeting Street. The doctor met them at the door. He was a gentle, white-haired man with wet eyes. He led Clara alone into a small parlor at the back of the house. A thin woman sat by the window in a shawl. Her hair had gone entirely white. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes, when she turned her head at the sound of the door, were the blue that Clara had carried in her memory for 3 years and 4 months, the exact shade of the Montana sky above Hawks Ridge on a clear October morning. "Mama," Clara said. Martha Ellsworth opened her arms. They stood together for a very long time without speaking. Caleb Hawk, watching from the parlor door, did something he had not done since the winter of 1878, when his own mother had died in his arms. He turned his face to the door frame, and he wept quietly, with his forehead pressed against the polished wood. Jed Hawk stood behind him with one hand on his brother's shoulder. Samuel Hawk stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes closed. Zeke Hawk, the youngest of them all, was smiling and crying at the same time. 4 men who had lost their mother 11 years ago stood in the hallway of a doctor's house in Charleston, and they watched a mother who had been lost come back into the arms of her child, and every one of them understood that they were being given something that would never be taken from them again. Martha Ellsworth came back to Montana in the spring of 1890. She sold the last of the Ellsworth property in Charleston, which had been recovered from Uncle Horace's estate after his conviction, and she used the funds to buy passage west and to furnish the little cottage that her daughter had already built for her 1/4 mile up the ridge, tucked into a grove of young pines. She said the first time she walked through its door, "Clara, my darling, you built this for me before you even knew I was alive." She did not say anything else. She sat down in the small rocking chair by the hearth, and she rocked, and she smiled, and she did not stop smiling for most of the rest of that spring. She took to Montana the way a seed takes to good soil. She called Jed the quiet one and brought him cups of tea without asking whether he wanted tea. She called Samuel the bright one, though he was the one with the deepest wound in him, and he laughed softly at the name and allowed it because his own mother had called him the same. She called Zeke my sweet youngest, and Zeke took to stopping by her cottage every morning to split her kindling, and stayed each time to drink coffee with her and hear the old Charleston stories of his mother-in-law's girlhood. She called Caleb my son simply and without ceremony from the first week. Caleb, who had buried his own mother at 25, heard that word fall from her lips and went silent for a whole afternoon, and then came back to the main house and put both arms around his wife and said nothing for a long time because there were no words for what Martha Ellsworth had just given him. Clara knew she was carrying a child by the first week of July. She did not tell Caleb. She wanted to be sure. She went to her mother alone in the cottage, and Martha touched Clara's face with both hands, and Martha laughed with a deep, pure joy that she had not laughed with in a dozen years. And Martha said, "Oh, my daughter, you are. The Lord is very good." Clara planned the telling. She asked Zeke to make a small wooden cradle, something simple, a practice piece, nothing elaborate. She did not tell him why. She said, "Tell your brothers it is for the Olsen baby down in the valley." Zeke, trusting her, said he would, and he carved the cradle in 7 days out of clear yellow pine, and he rubbed it smooth with linseed oil, and he did not suspect. On the first Sunday in September, with the afternoon light slanting gold through the new parlor windows, Clara set the cradle in the center of the long pine table in front of 5 people: Caleb, Jed, Samuel, Zeke, Martha. She stood at the head of the table with both hands resting upon her own belly, which was still scarcely changed at all, and she said, "This cradle was not made for any Olsen baby down in the valley. It was made for the next hawk." For 1 full breath nobody moved. Samuel made a noise that was half a shout and half a sob, and he stood up so fast that his chair went over backwards. Zeke came around the table and caught Clara up and lifted her an inch off the floor before he remembered himself and set her down with enormous care as if she were made of glass. Jed did not speak. Jed stood up and walked out the front door of the house without a word. Clara started to move after him, alarmed, but Martha caught her hand and pressed it. "Let him go, daughter. Some men have to weep where no eyes can see them. He will come back." Caleb had not risen. Caleb had come around the corner of the table and had sunk down to his knees in front of his wife, and he had laid both his large, hard, scarred hands flat across her belly, and he had pressed his forehead against her belly, and he was whispering something she could not entirely hear, and she understood it was prayer, and she laid her hand on the top of his dark head, and she began to pray with him quietly. The great blizzard came down out of the bitterroots on the 10th day of January in 1891. It came like something out of the Old Testament. The wind rose to a scream. The snow fell for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping. The temperature dropped below 0 in the morning of the 2nd day and did not rise again. 5 feet of snow piled against the north wall of the main house. No rider could have come up from Missoula. No doctor could have come up from the valley. And on the 3rd night of the storm, Clara went into labor. Martha took command. She had been a minister's wife and had sat by 100 Charleston sickbeds. "Zeke," she said, "boil water, all the water we have, and when that is gone, boil more." Samuel, linens, every clean cloth in the house torn into strips laid out here. Jed, guard that door. The wolves will smell the blood. Do not let one come within 50 yards of this porch. Caleb, sit by your wife. Hold her hand. Pray. Nothing else. Leave the rest to me. The labor went on for 14 hours. Clara did not scream. She breathed. She bit down on a folded strip of leather that Jed brought her, and when the contractions came, she remembered what old Corporal Thorne had said to her on the Kansas City platform, that women on the frontier did not cry, they fought. And so she fought. She fought through the long black hours of the storm. Caleb held her hand the entire time and did not once let go of it, and when she cried out softly, he whispered Psalm 23 to her over and over in his low, rough voice. He could not remember all of it. He would get stuck on a line and go back and begin again. Clara kept count of his psalms through the pain the way a woman counts rosary beads, and it was a great comfort. At 4 in the morning of the 4th day, just as the storm outside began at last to break and the wind began to fall, the baby came. Martha caught him. She lifted him up, and he cried a strong, clear cry, and she laid him at once upon Clara's breast. "A boy," Martha said. "He is perfect, Clara. He has his father's mouth, and his grandfather Thomas's eyes." Clara looked down into the small red face. She began to weep without making a sound. Caleb knelt at the side of the bed, and Caleb could not speak at all. Jed came into the room. His rifle was still in his hand. There was frost in his long hair. He stopped at the foot of the bed. Clara held out the baby to him. "Come, Jed. Come and meet your nephew." Jed Hawk had not held an infant since he was a boy of 5, and his mother had placed newborn Zeke in his arms. He came to the side of the bed, and he laid down his rifle, and he took the baby into his 2 brown hands, as if he were being entrusted with the whole remaining sum of God's mercy upon this earth. He did not speak. He only looked. And then slowly, very slowly, as the child turned its small face up toward him, Jed Hawk smiled. It was the first true smile his family had seen on his face since Running Deer had died 3 winters before, and Samuel, seeing it from the doorway, had to turn away and press his scarred cheek against the door jamb to keep from breaking entirely. Samuel held him next. Samuel's great tanned hands enfolded the baby more gently than those hands had ever done anything in his life. He bent his scarred face down over the small, soft head, and he whispered something to the child that no one else could hear, and Clara, watching, understood that Samuel Hawk had just named at long last the son he had lost in Colorado 7.5 years ago. Whatever that name had been, Samuel had carried it in silence for 7.5 years, and he had laid it at last into the warm crown of this new nephew's head, and he had set it free. Zeke held him last. Zeke did not cry. Zeke laughed. Zeke said, "Oh, you little scrap of a thing. Oh, you tiny, loud thing. I will teach you everything I know, and it will not be much, and your uncles will teach you the rest." Caleb looked at Clara. "What shall we call him?" Clara looked at her husband, and then around the lamp-lit room at the 4 faces watching her, her mother, and the 3 brothers, and she said, "Jacob Thomas Hawk, for your father and mine." The storm outside was gone by full dawn. The first light broke golden over the snow-covered bitterroots, and that light came slanting in through the frost-rimmed window of the bedroom, and it fell upon the face of the newest hawk in the world. 1 year passed. It was January of 1891 no longer, but January of 1892, and Jacob Thomas Hawk was 1 year old. Zeke had married that summer. A quiet, solemn girl named Elizabeth Langston, a niece of old Dr. Ambrose Langston of Charleston, who had come west to visit the Hawks after the birth and who had stayed. Zeke had built them a small cabin up the same slope where Martha's cottage stood, and Elizabeth kept his workshop books and was already expecting their first child. Samuel had not married. Samuel did not speak of marrying, but Samuel laughed more now. Samuel's thoroughbred mares had both foaled strong colts the previous spring, and the beginnings of a proper bloodline were standing in the new stone barn below the ridge. Samuel spent many evenings in Martha's cottage, drinking her good tea and talking to her about horses, and Martha listened to him in the way only women who have buried one of their own can listen to a man like Samuel. Jed had built himself a small log house, 1 full mile up the ridge into the deeper pines, a place of quiet and privacy where he could still be alone when the noise of nephews and a sister and a brother's wife and a mother-in-law became too much for him. He came down to the main house for supper every Sunday night without fail. He was teaching little Jacob, who was only just beginning to speak his first word. It was not yet Mama. It was not yet Papa. It was a word in the Nez Perce tongue that meant sky, and Jed was patient, and Jed was certain the boy would have it before his second birthday. Martha had started a small Sunday school in the main parlor at the request of 3 Valley families. She taught Bible stories. Clara taught reading. The Ridge had become, without any of them intending it, the gathering place of a small and growing congregation of settler children. On a still bright afternoon in mid-January, Clara and Caleb sat together on the porch of the main house. Jacob was asleep in a basket between their chairs. The bitterroots stood white and huge across the valley. A single eagle circled far up in the blue. "Do you ever miss Charleston?" Caleb asked after a while. Clara thought about it carefully. She thought about her mother and father lying in the old cemetery. She thought about the magnolia in front of the public library. She thought about the small white sanctuary of Grace Baptist. "I miss my father and mother in heaven," she said. "I miss the smell of magnolia blossoms in April. I miss the sea a little in the summer evenings. But I do not miss the girl who stood at the altar of Grace Baptist Church in May of 1889. That girl is not me. She was a kind, frightened child, and she died that morning when the man she trusted walked away, and from her ashes a woman rose on a train platform in Kansas City with a brass medal in her hand and a silver cross beneath her collar. That woman is Clara Hawk of Hawk's Ridge, and she is not sorry for any of it." Caleb reached for her hand. He held it. He did not speak for a long moment. "I do not know. He said what I did in my life that made me worthy of you. I expect I will never know. I expect the Lord alone knows, but I have sworn to use every day I am given on this ridge to be worthy of the gift, Clara. I swear it again now. You have been worthy, Caleb Hawk," she said softly. "From the first night when you carried my trunk up those stairs, you have been worthy." Down in the yard below the porch, Samuel was saddling a young chestnut for an afternoon ride. Jed was coming up the path from his cabin in the pines, a brace of mountain grouse slung over his shoulder for supper. Zeke was whistling in his workshop behind the barn, and the bright ring of his hammer on the anvil floated up the slope in the cold, still air. Elizabeth and Martha were laughing together in the cottage garden, wrapped in shawls against the cold. Bent over some small thing Elizabeth was showing Martha in the palm of her hand. The sun began to go down behind the bitterroots. The light on the peaks turned gold, then rose, then at last a deep, soft purple. The first star came out. The baby stirred in his basket. Clara bent down and lifted him up into her arms and kissed the warm crown of his head. She rose. She carried him inside out of the cold toward the lamp-lit kitchen where the supper was waiting. Caleb stood and followed her. At the threshold of the main house he paused. He looked back once at the long valley, at the white mountains, at the yellow windows of his mother-in-law's cottage, at his brothers moving about their evening work in the failing light. And then he went inside with his wife and his son, and he closed the door behind him softly against the Montana cold. Inside the house the fire was bright, and the bread was on the table, and a woman's voice was speaking grace. It was a sound that had lived in that house long ago, and had gone out of it and had come back at last and would never again go away.